is we're diving in deeper into the research report that HmntyCntrd did in partnership with dscout about organizational trauma. And just to kind of level set before we dive in, when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about any event or experience that leads to distress, impairment, or emotional, physical, spiritual, or psychological harm. And when we're talking about spiritual, we're talking about the things that keep you grounded, the things that give you meaning, the things that give you purpose. And so trauma can also disrupt that. And more times than not, trauma is often seen as something that only happens to individuals. So again, I'm going to dive in just super briefly into kind of like the individual perspective of trauma versus the organizational perspective of trauma. So with the individual, traumatic stress can result from even caring for others who are experiencing trauma. Whereas from the organizational perspective, it's more of that cumulative trauma becomes embedded in organizational cultures. With individual trauma, susceptibility to trauma depends on individual history and other factors. Whereas for organizational trauma, susceptibility to trauma is dependent on organizational history and other factors. So as you're kind of like thinking about your own orgs and thinking about things that have happened in the past and the ways that it hasn't or has been dealt with, that's what that's getting at. For the individual perspective, individuals can become hypervigilant and also limit exposure to others. Whereas for organizational trauma, organizations can tend to strengthen protective boundaries to limit exposure to outsiders. So think about like all, the tea that within your organizations of something that just went bad and the ways that the organization either used fear or silence in order to kind of keep that in-house. And then lastly, in terms of the individual perspective, individuals can become susceptible to depression or even like loss of hope. And we're going to get into hope a little bit later today. Whereas for organizational trauma, organizations become susceptible to isolation and despair in terms of internal change and things changing direction. And so these are some of the things that we started to unpack and uncover within this research report that we did with dscout. And one of the things that, I'll kick it off to you, Alison. I'm curious about your perspective on this is, one of the things that we've noticed in the report and the theme is just this lack of acknowledgement around trauma and workplace hardships and our stories. And I know that's something me and you were talking about on the other line, and just, we'll open the floor to you to kind of dive into that.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, right. Jumping off the bat, I'm going and listening to you and thinking about all of the ways that the organization I was in that truly led to my burnout, that was traumatic, that was abusive, of little crumbs that started before I even worked there. And I should have known how bad it was when I got inside. So if we're thinking about acknowledgement, we're looking at I really start to think about the lack of unpaid emotional labor, right? The fact that you get these companies and organizations that say, oh, well, this is just a one-off, or this is this person, or this is because of this project. It's not, the belief is that it's not systemic. They're not going to acknowledge the whole of the situation, right? And the individuals. So what led to these processes? What led to the fact that you're not going to acknowledge these things? Is it because there's a lack of paperwork that people want to do? Does it mean that, like, this one has just popped into my mind, so I'll talk about it. Back when I worked in built environment design, before I came in-house to the brand, I worked as a third-party project manager for them, overseeing hospitality design and construction. And I remember being sexually harassed on the workplace, on the job, because it was just me and a bunch of men in this day in and day out. And I told the PM I was working with there, and they told me they had bigger fish to fry because we were off schedule. How is that bigger fish to fry? And then you get inside and you don't acknowledge it. I bring it up and I run it up the flagpole, right? Up the chain for their company. My company acknowledges it, but their company doesn't acknowledge it. They don't acknowledge that there is fear, there's harm, there's abuse within this workplace. It's super normalized. And so, you know, I don't know how many of you all here are also built environment designers, but also in tech, right? Being the only Black woman in a space, I did my job well. I was great at what I did, but I had to suppress my womanhood, my femininity, my personhood for the sake of the scope, schedule, and budget of this organization, right? And it only got worse once I actually started working for them.
And I think too, part of the lack of acknowledgement of our stories or the things that we've gone through is, I mean, part of it's a survival thing, right? Like if you acknowledge every traumatic thing that happened to you, especially within these robust capitalistic systems, like there's a cost to that. But I think to your point, we often normalize it. And I know like one illustration I've used before is, you know, if you had a really good friend who came to you and they were like, you know, I'm in this relationship and I feel like I don't have a voice. I feel like I always have to monitor how I show up and leave parts of myself at home. I feel like if I challenge them, I might experience retaliation. You be telling that friend, get out of that relationship, have some boundaries and move on. But with work, you know, when we apply that, it's, well, not everywhere is, you know, nowhere is perfect. Or it's just a part of the workplace experience. And we don't take that same approach that we would to this relationship that we would to ourselves. And there's a cost to that builds up over time. And I've been encouraged, I think, with 2020, I think a lot of people kind of like the scales fell off their eyes and they're like, I think I want better. I think I deserve better. And I think I'm overdue better. And I think people are now starting to find the language to talk about the culture and the issues that they're experiencing and starting to dream about what's something better, what that could look like, you know?
Definitely. I think about the advice, right? Oh yeah, if I were talking to one of my good friends in their romantic relationship, I'd be run for the hills. You are at a red flag factory, right? Like this is the supply chain for red flags. But in the workplace, I would say, well, CYA, what's your CYA file? Every day at the end of the day, acknowledge what happened to you, take screenshots, have a swipe file. I remember working with a colleague in hospitality design, and he was telling me that every night he plugs in a little USB and he records all of the things. Exactly, Tracy, keeping receipts every single day. Wow. Why is that good advice? Why are we encouraging people to endure abusive relationships? Why are we normalizing it by saying, well, just, you know, keep receipts, write it down until you get enough receipts, maybe that somebody will do something, right? Instead of saying, okay, so I see that you now have to CYA, you have to find all these receipts. Maybe it's time to start looking for a new job. Maybe it's time to start looking for a place that is not going to have you operating from a place of fear every single day.
Exactly. And Rachael is a licensed social worker and also has a lot of experience within design and UX. And I remember us having a conversation offline about the importance of having an appreciation for how you can honor the validity of your story and your experience. Just from your own background experience, can you speak a little more into that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about, there's so many ways to react and to respond to that. I'm thinking about something that Alison, you were just saying around like suppression, like what were those things, whether they were emotions or thoughts or this denial of what you knew to be true, and that suppression of that because of that lack of acknowledgement of what was happening. So one of the things that I have seen in both my own experiences over the years, both in and outside of design context, I will say that, but also what a lot of people have shared with me is just this really gross, in every sense of the word, like amount of minimization that occurs. And I think that's, that was such a strong thing that I reacted to in the report when I just saw the word, and the effect that minimizing can really have on us. It's this combination of this how do you suppress what you need to do in order to do the work at hand and work in these environments because of all these reasons that really can and often mimic like a bad relationship? And how do we navigate the reality of that while also trying to take good care of ourselves at the same time? I find those things in constant direct conflict if you are in a very unhealthy, toxic work environment. And even if you have great colleagues that are immediate within that bubble, it is incredibly difficult to maintain some level of space and distance in order to just do what you need to do in order to get by.
Yeah. And, I think that it kind of starts to get at two things that also surfaced in the report, which is institutional betrayal and gaslighting. And we don't use that term lightly, coming from a counseling background. I know Rachael being a licensed social worker, like these are very strong and like intentional words that we're using. So institutional betrayal is actually a term that was coined by Jennifer Fried. And institutional betrayal refers to wrongdoings perpetuated by an institution upon individuals dependent on that institution. And this also includes failure to prevent or respond supportively to wrongdoings by individuals. So harassment or microaggressions or retaliations, et cetera, committed within the context of the institution. So, for me, I think about having a manager that I reported several times had receipts because my mom's in HR and my mom has always told me to keep those receipts. I had colleagues who testified on my behalf during the internal investigation. Nothing happened. Actually, one of the managers got promoted. And so it's like, okay, so what is actually happening here? If I'm following the system to, protect myself, and yet I'm not being protected. So that's institutional betrayal. And then you have gaslighting. And again, this is an abuse tactic. Okay. Like that's how serious that word is. And gaslighting is a common emotional abuse tactic that makes the receiver doubt their perception of reality. So I think one of the best examples that I've seen of this being played out, especially during the pandemic, is the way resilience has been used. The problem isn't the systems and the ways of working and the expectations and how we're not hiring more people to help you do your work. The problem isn't us. The problem is you. You need to be more resilient. You need to adjust. You need to do that so that you can work more and work better, more efficiently. And so these are two things that we saw constantly throughout that report. And it's kind of wild how normal it is, within the workplace.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes me think about my experience with these playbooks and coming back to the DIYer, right? And the idea of, okay, we're going to give you these tools to use at your disposal for you to go and do your best, and you become more resilient. And it was the comment by Laura. Let me see if I can find it, but essentially it was talking about how she got $100 stipend for mental health or gym or whatever, right? Like, and my first thought was, that doesn't even cover a therapist visit. So many therapists are going out of network and it doesn't cover the cost of this work. So you're giving me the idea of a stipend, telling me to work on my resilience, and that I have to go ahead and do it myself, rather than you making the organizational, operational, systemic change within this place so that I don't have to go do that, right? Like, I will do that as a person for my own personal development. This should not be the shield that I have to go and wear to come into the workplace every single day.
Yeah. And, it's interesting too, because, for this report, we mainly focused on design organizations, right? And this is organizations, industries that pride itself in being human-centered and caring about people. Now, granted, I understand the difficulty of doing that in systems that are kind of banking on you to not fully acknowledge your own humanity, but yet we were noticing within the research that the stain of that rubbed off onto individuals and teams within within design. And so something that's been coming to surface over the last couple of weeks since the report has been out is I think a lot of individuals are struggling with an element of potential complicity, either individually or at an organizational level within organizational trauma. That complicity, whether it is, being silent about it, witnessing harm happening and not doing anything about it. And that brings up the third theme that I want us to kind of dive into a little bit. This idea of moral injury and the ways that it plays a part in this conversation about addressing complicity of organizational trauma. So moral injury, when we talk about moral injury, we're referring to damage done to someone's conscience or moral compass within the workplace. So moral injury can come from actions that the person themselves perpetuates, situations they have witnessed, or situations in which they have failed to prevent specific activities from taking place that go against their own beliefs. If you're in design, if you're in a role where extending empathy is a key part of what you do, like we have all experienced moral injury. We've all have had those moments. And it's a concept that covers psychological, social, cultural, and again, spiritual aspects of trauma. So when a moral injury does occur, it can result in profound emotional guilt and shame for the victim. In other instances, it can also induce feelings of great anger, betrayal, disbelief, disgust, and a sort of moral disorientation. So morally injurious events include something you have done or failed to do, something that someone else has done or fails to do to you or for you, something you learned about after it had already happened. Just think about those like back of the room, like tea conversations, or lastly, something you have witnessed. And I think that a lot of us, especially as I go through the report, kind of wrestling through these morally injurious events that we have also experienced within these settings.
There's something in that, Vivianne, that makes me think about, I would almost add another word to some of this list, because I have experienced this myself. I know others have shared this with me, and that when we are sometimes in these types of environments, we believe that we will be the exception to the rule. Like we believe that because we are so deeply empathic, we know we have other lived experience, we can bring that in. For me, I can say like, but I'm a social worker. I understand these things. I understand trauma. Like I talk about that. And to that also comes with this really strong element of this failure. And I would say, for me, like speaking about me, it's an embarrassment and a failure that I was not able to protect other people sometimes in these environments. I think about the one of the concepts within trauma and a lot of the trauma language and understanding is, what is a lot of this is what we're talking about is like acute on chronic. Like that's how I really like see it. That's how I hear it. I feel that when I was reading the report. And so how do you navigate these multiple things that are true and is incredibly messy, is complex? We have systems and structures supposedly in place to actually help us advocate, which I think more often than not completely and utterly fail people. Like I have yet to hear, I welcome the opportunity, but I have yet to hear of an HR system in any small or large organization that has actually been truly supportive of individuals when they are navigating these kinds of things. Now, if it exists, like I will eat those words and I will like happily say like, wave the flag of that shining example, but I have yet to see one either for both myself, but also for others as well. And what does that do? Again, I feel like it almost adds these daggers to the things that are already like incredibly wounded and that we are already we're weakened and trying to figure out on our own, often on our own. So I feel like the whole conversation could be talked about around moral injury, like this idea of exceptionalism, like we are the exception to those rules. And then the significant vicarious trauma that happens as a result of that.
Yeah. And it's I mean I've noticed a couple of comments in the chat in terms of you know, someone wrote in here, um, you know, they're playing devil's advocate. They're like, I work in this space to come up against the wall anytime we are trying to fix the root cause of systemic trauma because ... people. It breaks my brain thinking about how an organization can proactively solve for this through developing or hiring for better trauma and awareness skills. And I do think, and don't worry, we'll get to like hope and healing like towards the end of this. But in order for us to get there, we have to actually be honest about what we're facing. And
Yep.
so, you know, when I think about comments like that, I think about the need for accountability. And this is a culture shift, right? You know, I think when a lot of folks, especially when you think about diversity and inclusion, a lot of companies are very reactive, and often over-index on diversity. So hiring, recruitment, you know, we're going to whip up this initiative and throw it to the wall and hope that it sticks. And they're not proactive about inclusion, which is culture, which is about it's about accountability. And you know, for me, until the lack of inclusive and trauma-informed behaviors are treated as a performance issue and not a personality one, then it's going to be a while before you see change within an organization. Like that's the culture bit though. Like there has to be a level of accountability towards those behaviors, and to view the lack of inclusive behaviors and an understanding of trauma as a performance issue versus a personality one, I think is going to be critical for companies, especially in light of the ongoing pandemic and Gen Z millennials making up more of the workforce, which we're more diverse. We've had the privilege of being able to talk more openly about, you know, mental health and things like that. And, you know, free lunch and foosball isn't going to cut it for us anymore. And so companies are actually going to have to invest in doing this work. I love it. The other thing I'll pivot us into is in terms of, you know, as you're kind of thinking about morally injurious events that you've experienced, that you've witnessed, it brings up the importance of grief and the need to grieve and the role of grief in understanding and unpacking these experiences. You know, it's been 2 years of us being in this pandemic, and how many of y'all, you know, within your workplaces, this is rhetorical, so don't even answer in the chat. How many of y'all within your workplaces have been encouraged and trained on the role of grief during this time? Or how many of you are seeing your leaders lean more into the understanding of grief within leadership? And that's a huge aspect of this work, to learn how to grieve well, to learn how to process those emotions well, because it impacts the way that you interpret future experiences of morally injurious events, but also too, it's a way to cleanse the spirit in a lot of ways. I'm curious about, you know, Rachel or Alison, like, what has grief looked like for you? Because I know the three of us have our own experiences. That could be a whole nother talk, but what has grief looked like for you? And how have you learned to grieve?
Grief through my journey, and as we're going to get into hope and healing, the stages of grief have changed from something that is this negative to something that is necessary, something is positive. Because through change, I have to grieve the person who I once was. I have to grieve those experiences that I once had, lay them to rest, and move on and move forward and move past this. So when you're starting to talk about grief, it also pulls into my mind a little bit about adaptive leadership and thinking about values, loyalties, and losses. And losses with like point 2 of being grief, because you're looking at what are people value, what do they value within these systems? What are they loyal to within these systems? And what will people have to lose, right, in order to change these systems? Or what is the fear that they might lose? And if we're not good with grief as a people in general, grieving a loss doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative thing, right? Like, it's just letting it go. It's processing those emotions. It's going through the paces of it and letting it be, instead of taking whatever, fear or anxieties or whatever you've attached to the idea, or that you don't want someone else to have, away from me, from this scarcity kind of mindset. So I don't know if people are really able to grieve properly while they're in a scarcity mindset and operating from fear, versus, letting grief become this healthy place that you visit, and maybe that you visit regularly and become comfortable with. And becoming comfortable with grief in all of its forms is powerful, it's transformative.
Think
As
about
part of
something.
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Allison. Finish your.
That was it. I was just saying it's part of the process, right?
Yeah.
Like, we can't just skip over it. We can't cut corners. You can't avoid grief. You can try to circumvent it, but it's part of the process. If you want to do it all the way, you're gonna have to grieve. You're gonna have to grieve whatever those losses are, or those experiences, or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think this definition and these terms around grief are really crucial to these other aspects of loss, abandonment, attachment. I mean, all these things that are part of that literacy around trauma. A few things that are coming to mind for me. One is that I often in probably a lot of my like social work and design practice, I really often think about this thing that a fellow social worker said to me when we were working together, and there was just tension amongst our team, and a lot of people were just anxious about something that was happening at the time. And she used this phrase about rolling with discomfort. And like we all just need to roll with some of the discomfort. And it wasn't a accept the hardship. It was really a like, how can we move through this together and make some decisions as a collective based off of what we know at the time, because sometimes we don't know all the things that we might need to know. I saw this comment from Ruben, there's a lot of comments that are coming in, but around like restoration and repair. And I think about what does it mean to move through grief? And some of the work that I have that really resonates for me is around the work around, it's sometimes called ambiguous grief or complicated grief. I see it getting some updated definitions, especially throughout the pandemic. And so I would encourage anyone who has experienced grief in the workplace, and especially in a traumatic workplace, to read up on some of that great work that's being done. Pauline Boss is one of the biggest players in that area. And I find it beneficial to both acknowledge and to recognize and to understand that it may be lifelong, it may be ongoing, it may come at you in unexpected moments. Like I know what the things are that might upset me, that if I come across them, I sometimes have shared that, close to 20 years ago at this point, I was in a really bad car accident. I wasn't hurt, but I was literally in shock. My car was totaled. And for many years, I could not go anywhere near that intersection where that accident happened. And at this point, because so many years have passed, I still have this experience when I come up to this intersection that used to be a two-way stop and is now a four-way stop because there are so many accidents. But I come up to that intersection and I still feel that small wave like come over me. It isn't huge anymore like it used to be, like especially in the early months, after that. But I think the understanding and that integration and that acceptance that this is a thing that happened, this is a thing that is hard, and this is a thing that I can literally move through. And I think when it comes to work, sometimes that there are going to be days when that is much easier than others. I've had seasons personally where I have I feel like I have been at my strongest, and I've had other seasons where I feel like I've been like, I'm right back at square one. Like, why am I like either reliving this, or what is this, I'll call it a season of upset or sadness or loss. Like, what is this trying to tell me? Because it is trying to tell me something. It's trying to move me through another level of like restoration and repair and integration of what I have been through and what I know. And so I'll just say that these A words keep coming to mind: acknowledgement, acceptance. And some of those things doesn't have to be like, accept this bad place for what it is. It's like, no, accept that this occurred, and commit to that advocacy within yourself that you can move through some of this, that you really can. I mean, it is possible.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. And I think also too, I want to surface two kind of like questions, comments that came up. One was Ruben, who said, we have a long way to go, unfortunately. To grieve together, we need to feel safe. And one of the side effects of trauma is deep mistrust. It's a vicious cycle. Marja also said, I wonder how we can embrace and honor the grieving process within a culture that wants to deny death as a part of humanity. And I think really what that gets at, and I think in general, people are starting to recognize this more and more, is like, you can't depend on your organization to do their part in your healing. They're not. And I think to Rachel's point, there's a part of accepting that reality and understand the reality for what that is, then gives you opportunity to choose to heal. I think sometimes the pain of the reality of what we're in right now can feel more comfortable, more familiar than the pain it takes to heal. Because it's painful to heal. You got to sit with yourself. You got to sit with those memories. You got to sit with those emotions. It's painful to heal. And there's a lot of people who don't choose to start making steps towards that. So I'll get really practical in terms of, what does this look like for me, even within, not only being within a toxic workplace, but also being on the other side of it, is, I go back to my trauma therapy days when I was doing, as a therapist, working with people in trauma and addiction recovery. And it's really about putting in rituals into my day and into my way of working. So one ritual that I would do to grieve when I was in corporate was on a monthly basis, being able to journal and process and just kind of sit with what the reality was, but also to either invite my therapist or invite a friend into that, who was also able to kind of carry that burden with me. When I used to do trauma therapy, I would have a kind of like winding down playlist. So it would signal to my mind and my body, like, working and hearing, 20 traumatic stories today is done. And now other things are beginning. When I left corporate about 10, 11 months ago, I did a ritual where I wrote down the ways that I had been betrayed and harmed and wronged and silenced. And I wrote those down in individual pieces of paper, and then I burned them as a symbol, as a practice, like, let it go. But you have to carve out space for you to heal. Because if you don't, then what you're doing is coping. And coping and healing are two different things. And so it's about drawing those boundaries. It's about drawing those spaces. It's about having friends who don't work in the same industry as you, so you can like not trauma bond with everything that everyone's going through. But there are ways to begin to carve that time out. And it's not, your workplace isn't going to do it. Your workplace isn't going to, we have to recognize that we have to demand that and fight for that for ourselves. And so we are going to go into this question of how do you know that you've been healing? We're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like for each of us. But before we do that, I do just want to like take a moment to like ground us. We had some of these moments within the report in and of itself, and I'll drop it in the chat, but I'm just going to just take a moment to kind of read through these mindfulness moments before we get into how do you know that you've healed. So feel free to just listen to my voice, to read along. I just want us to like take a moment just to like ground ourselves. So we'll do 3 of them. Breathe in. I am enough in this moment. Breathe out. I am more than what I can produce. Breathe in. My story deserves to be honored. Breathe out. My pain requires no apology or explanation. Breathe in. My voice is worthy of being heard. Breathe out. I will not hide. I belong here. A lot of people don't know this, but the affirmations, the mindfulness moments that are in the report are actually things that I worked through and wrote for myself when I was working through and healing through my own workplace trauma and abuse. And not only just being with, you know, my previous employer, but there is an employer where, and I saw some comments about this in terms of like litigation and the emotional wear and tear, but there is an employer where I did have to go into litigation. And I signed away my voice. That employer isn't even on my LinkedIn. And it was exhausting and it broke me. And it took me a long time to recover from that. But being on the other side of it, I have a much better understanding of my voice and boundaries and what does it look like to heal and to move forward. And so I want us to each kind of jump into this last topic of how do you know that you've been healing? And I mean, the 3 of us are kind of like gabbing about this last week and just getting like super excited. But actually, and I'll kick us off. I was talking to a former colleague last week, and they're struggling, like a lot of us have been on this call. And they asked, how do you know that you've been healing? And the first thing that came to mind, I was like, honestly, I'm less afraid. Like, I'm less afraid. I don't think I realized how much I was operating from a place of fear versus freedom. I'm more willing to trust my gut. I'm more willing to bet on myself, to advocate for myself. I'm not always thinking about, if someone presents an opportunity or an idea, my mind doesn't go immediately to why won't that work? What's wrong with it? And why it won't be successful. I'm much more quick to pivot to let's build on that. Here's some other possibilities that we could do and pursue. And I mean, there's different things that, and I'll jump in later, but one of the first things is just recognizing I'm not as afraid. And I don't think I really understood what that felt like until I started to move along my healing journey. Not saying that fear is like absent, but it's more manageable. It has less of an impact on my decisions and how I think about myself and my own value. But yeah, that's one of like the first key things that I've noticed of how do I know that I've been healing.
So I didn't share this when we were chatting, the 3 of us were chatting last week, but I thought about this over the long weekend and was really wanting to pinpoint some things, both either in myself, but also within my little family. And for me, I think one of the biggest signs that I know I am healing and continuing to heal is when I hear my daughter hum. And she does a lot of drawing, but if I hear her either humming while she's drawing or singing in the shower, to me, that is indicative that I am taking care of myself enough to be able to be way more present, like for her and with her. And so for anyone who is like a parent or a caregiver, like that is on this right now or watching it, that to me has been transformative, because I was finding a couple of years ago, I was having a hard time being a good parent or even a good enough parent to my kid who deserves to have like the best. And I feel like that is an opportunity to break some of those generations of trauma that can exist. So whatever I inherited, I have an opportunity to try to transform what that is for me so that it has a different kind of a legacy and impact on her. So for me, that's been one of the biggest ones.
I love that. What about you, Alison? What are you thinking over there?
So this, and please don't mind me, there's someone cutting down a palm tree over by me, but lovely. One of the points that I brought up last week was, after reading this report, I was finding my triggers, right? And realizing that I could work through them so much more quickly. I shared with Rachael and Vivianne that, you know, I felt these triggers through some of the supplemental reading materials, and it was coming up, and all it took was for me to go on a 5-mile walk, maybe like 2 hours, just put my headphones in, zone out, do these laps in the stadium, and I was able to acknowledge what happened to me, to own my responsibilities in it, to not just intellectualize it away, to figure out where somatically I'm feeling what I'm feeling, putting a name to it, putting a place to it, putting a somatic response to it, and moving through, and then saying, okay, is this regret? Is this rejection? Is it whatever, right? I had all this language that I've used and gained throughout all this time in therapy and healing. And now I'm able to use those tools. It's like an instant pot. It's like an emotional instant pot, right? Like, I'm able to take all of it, put it in there, put the lid on, and then move through it and leave what I don't need to take with me, which is outstanding. And so on top of this, like, I'm happy to share with you all, is I also restarted therapy yesterday. And therapy coming from a place of preventative care and maintenance care is so much different than coming from a place of crisis and trauma, because now I'm able to figure out, like, well, I'm here because these are things that I've identified in myself that I have already started working on, but I don't have to do it by myself, right? So like in my healing journey, the fact that I am asking for help, I am not an island, and I have no intentions of being an island, right? Like, I'm asking for help, I'm asking for what I need, and I'm asking for it before I actually think I need it, before it becomes a problem, right? Like, I'm scheduling maintenance before maintenance gets scheduled for me.
I love that. And I think something that you get into as well is, it's the reality that, you know, healing and working through these issues isn't meant to be a solo journey. It's meant to be a shared one. It's meant to be done in community. And so it's about building your care team, right? So for me, it's my therapist, who is not only a Black woman, but she has experience in trauma counseling, but also she's experienced in counseling other therapists. Because I told her, you know, because I have that training, like, your bullshit radar needs to be on a whole different level with me. And so she keeps me honest. You know, I've given people within my inner circle permission to, you know, not only like, yes, encourage me, but to course correct me when they see me kind of going off the path of healing and restoration that I've set forth for myself. You know, when was the last time you had a physical? Like, it's a lot of things and people that you invite into that space. And I think something else that, you know, that's important to talk about is, like, healing will look different for each and every one of us. You know, for me, healing has looked like leaving a company. For healing for others, it's looked like them going to a different team within that company. For others, like Alison, it looks like leaving America and like living in Mexico for a little bit. So like, healing looks different, but I think at the core of that, it's important to trust your gut, to begin to trust your own voice and your own voice of care within you. There's actually some really interesting research on this in the book Radical Remission by Kelly Turner. And this is a book about how essentially, like, the power of the human spirit and innate wisdom of the body can help you overcome like certain illnesses and diseases. But in this book, it talks about how scientists have discovered that over 100 million neurons, the type of cells found in your brain, also exist inside the human digestive tract, which explains why people often say that they have like a gut feeling about something. And this is because the gut, with all its millions of neurons, can actually think and feel just like the brain can. Even more interesting has been the discovery that this kind of like second brain in your gut can act independently of the brain, meaning that your gut can decide to stop digesting food and send you a sudden like intuitive pang of warning without any input from your brain. And so far, the gut is the only organ that has been discovered to have this independent operating ability. And so I think a part of healing is like reconnecting to your gut and trusting your instincts about what do you need to heal. And it's not always going to be what I recommend or what Rachael or Alison or other people recommend, but like you really have to like reconnect with yourself, because I think in a lot of ways we're encouraged to disconnect from ourselves and instead connect to a lot of the capitalistic systems that we're working within.
Let's add something to that, Vivianne, because something that I thought I was doing really, really well for probably a number of years was this whole element of trusting myself. I pride myself on having like a really strong intuition, being sensitive and in tune and attuned to other people. And it wasn't until some really tough work with my own therapist, because I echo what you said. It's a lot of therapists have therapists themselves, and a lot of licensed professionals have therapists themselves. And so finding someone who can understand you, has like a, really like can respond to that bullshit meter is really critical, because I don't need like a foundational understanding. I need to go straight to the top sometimes, or like cut through like straight to the middle. But this element of self-trust is something that I needed someone else to help me figure that out, and figure it out on a deeper level where it was going to have that transformative change that was going to be lasting. Now, it might not last forever. I might need to revisit this. And it's something that I feel like I need to revisit on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also too, and say this before we dive into some of the questions. I've been keeping track of what y'all have been dropping in the chat. But I think something else that's really important in terms of processing healing from workplace trauma and being able to operate more from a place of freedom instead of fear is the role of hope and faith within that. Like, if you aren't hopeful that things could be better, that your situation and circumstance could change, then it's a lot harder to actually take the risk to step into that, to choose to heal and walk through that uncertainty. It's important to have hope. It's so important to have hope. And I think even for me, as I've been thinking about, 2022 and the pandemic, I'm like, I don't want to just survive. I want to flourish. I want to thrive. And so Jess asked this question: how do you have faith and hope that things could be better in a company setting? For me, there's a balance to this. And I see this a lot with design folks too, where they take that hope and it kind of becomes a reason for martyrdom, in terms of like neglecting themselves and really putting yourself in a place where you don't even recognize yourself anymore after that. And so for me, I actually first start, it's less of hope and faith that a company will change, especially like a large company and a capitalistic one. I had someone the other day who told me, the way that China is extreme with communism, America is with capitalism. And when you think about that extremeness, and the ways that like it actually takes to like shift culture at an organizational level, you have to start with yourself first. So like I first place hope and faith that I can feel better, that I can be more positive and optimistic, that I can get to a place where I'm not always being triggered by seeing certain ads, or like when I see the word resilience, triggering word, but you have to place kind of hope and faith in yourself first, and like where you can be and how you can grow and heal. And then when it comes to the community, you know, I think it's hope that other people can experience that too. And maybe there's pockets and there's ways that you carve out space to do that. This is actually something we dive in more into in our Healing Conversations course of what does it look like to do this at an individual and team level. But it's definitely more of an art than a science. I'll put this question out here to Rachael and Alison of, does the organizational shift towards respect for the processes of grief, restoration, and repair have to come from the top / the C-suite, or can it be a grassroots movement? My first thought is the answer is yes. It has to come from both.
Yeah, it has to come from all places. And I really want to also make a caveat that, in my opinion, leadership does not, and oftentimes rarely comes from the top. Leadership is an innate quality in people, no matter where you're at, whether you are an IC, whether you are a people manager, whether you are someone who is entry level, because there's some of us who've been about this like burn it down corporate life, you know, since always. And at some point in time, we were still absolute beginners, right? So I think that leadership to change and promote grassroots change also has to come from the top, has to come from wherever it's going to come from. And those leaders who want to see a difference, who want to experience a difference, are going to do it. And if they're not going to be able to do it at the company that they're at, the hope is that we have this community, we're having these conversations, and we start leaving and we start going to these organizations where we are now put in places to be able to actually make that change, right? Like, you get folks like me who go, and I go into business design and strategy, where I take my design skills and think about, how are we designing the systems? How are we designing the processes? How am I working with that leadership, right? Like, my end goal, I'm gonna lay it online, is long-term behavioral change and incepting that at the beginning of companies so that someday they are growing, but they're trauma-informed from the start. They're inclusive from the start. They're equitable from the start, right? Yeah. And so I have to have that hope that things can get better. And I have to have that hope, and I get it day in and day out with my clients, with my colleagues, with my friends who ask for my opinion, who pay for my opinion on how they can make things better for their employees, right? And so that's a little bit of where my hope comes from, and my thought on terms of organizational redesign and restructuring. It has to come from everywhere, but that leadership, those leaders are going to come from anywhere in the org, not just from the top down. But you have to get buy-in from your key stakeholders. Come on, let's be honest here.
Yeah.
I think, you know, I think I'm going to agree with both of you. I think it comes down to top down and bottom up. I do think it is. I think there is something to be said about grassroots organizing efforts and how those can really exist and manifest in any kind of a workplace environment. But I think that probably the secret that doesn't always get as much attention is that crew of people who are in that curse of middle management. Because if you are a middle manager, you have some power, you have some influence, and you are responsible for a lot of people. And so you are both trying to adhere to whatever culture has been instituted. You are trying to change things in a critical way, but you are also often like protecting people and protecting supervisees. I think if there is a way to, I would say, build power for middle managers, build positive power, and create much more good trouble. Because if there is an army of people at that level, and then hierarchically, below that, when it comes to structure, there's an inertia with that I think is going to be very, very hard for top leaders within an organization to silence or to minimize or to expect that they're just going to figure it out on their own. I just see a lot of that's where a lot of burnout is occurring, and where a lot of people are moving on and they're saying I can't do this anymore, I'm done. And then some of these efforts sometimes fall.
Yeah. And I'll say this too, there's also a cost to that work. And we can get into, and we do dive into this again within our Healing Conversations course, we could talk about the cost of that and what does it actually look like to navigate that. I know in terms on like a personal level, like even for me, especially when you experience so many unhealthy workplaces and then you experience that one that like almost breaks you. Like for me, the key was to get really clear on who I am outside of what I can produce so that I can separate myself from this job and instead bet on me and choose on me. And the way that I've done that before, and I would encourage everyone to think about this because your employer pays into this benefit if you're at a larger company, is to take some paid time off. You could do that through medical leave, short-term medical or disability insurance will help pay for that. If you're in the States, FMLA leave will protect your job for that. And there's a lot of fear and like mindset work that you have to work through to get there. But it is possible to choose you and to bet on you. I know we're almost at time. Something that I do want to share, but as we wrap up is, we'll share the replay, we'll share some resources with you. But also too, within HmntyCntrd, like we dive a lot more into this in our upcoming Healing Conversations course. And this starts, registration for that closes this Friday at 5. So get it in while you can. And what this is a little different than our other live courses that we've done before, as this is a lot more practical. We'll have a lot more individual time, giving you tools to kind of process past and current trauma, as well as starting to do some of the mindset work needed in order for you to heal, in order for you to get clarity on what you need to do within your company and within yourselves and within your families. And so you can learn more about that here, giving you a special discount for that. But my encouragement to you in that, whether you work with HmntyCntrd, you work with Rachael, Alison, or whatever it may be, is to choose you. That there is healing, like there is peace, like there is better on the other side of doing this work. And it is so freeing and it is so good. But my encouragement is to do it in community, that you don't have to necessarily do it on your own. And so I will close our time out with this final mindfulness moment. And again, these are things that are in the report, but I'll close us out with these final affirmations and hope that you also give yourself permission and space after this call, if you can, to breathe and just to recognize your value and your worth. And it's far more than any team, any manager, or any company will tell you that it is. And so I'll close us out with these final 3. Breathe in, my grief is worthy of being honored. Breathe out, I don't have to grieve alone. Breathe in, my no is enough. Breathe out, I will honor my limits and rest. Breathe in, critique is a signal of hope. Breathe out, hope is not a scarcity. Ooh, I want to leave you with that. Like, hope is not a scarcity. And you don't have to explain or apologize away any of your experiences or the stories that you have experienced, because they are very real. And so with that, I hope that you're able to find some joy and rest throughout the rest of your week. I appreciate you for carving out the emotional energy to sit with us in this. I know it's not always easy. And we will send you the replay, resources, good vibes, energy. Let's get it this year. And we will talk to y'all soon. So take care, stay safe, and have an amazing rest of the week.